Hello. Hello to my faithful students. Familiar names, some not as familiar, which is great. All right, so let me get your names down and we will begin. So today we're working on the era of it's the 1830s, usually with the characterizations, the different titles and topics and chronological categories. The 1830s begins the era of the antebellum, known as the antebellum era, which just technically means before the war, before the 1861 Civil War. And so we're looking at a time in which Andrew Jackson loomed large as the president. Okay. And so it's a little historiographically is the fancy word, out of date to name the time period after him. Great man history isn't really popular as much anymore. Remember that is when you assume that events happen because of the great men in positions of great power and their personalities, their decisions, what they did, largely dictated how things went. Remember that social and cultural history are really strong now, where people look at the common folk. They look at the primary sources as far as letters of correspondence, the press, and archaeology, etc., to try to get a broader view than that, right? But maybe it was a little bit intellectually lazy to still title this topic the Jacksonian era, but it is stuck for better and for worse. It somewhat has stuck. So hence you see that in the title. So growing democracy, remember that you could have a democratization process socially, economically, and or politically, right? Demos just means the people in Greek. And so it's putting more power in the hands of the people in one way or another. And supposedly there was a shift in all three realms in the 1830s toward the people, for better and for worse. All right. And remember, when we talk about democratization, it's a relative term also, right? It's compared to the era of the founding fathers and the early republic that we've already gone over, the first, 5 or 6 presidents before him. And so keep that in mind, because we can't help but compare it and contrast it with today. And by today's standards, it's not going to sound very impressive. Okay. But for that time period, some of these changes were deemed by contemporaries of that time as remarkable, as worthy of note for history. Okay. So one of the most interesting books I've read is Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, spelt like Alexis, and then D-E, and then capital Tocqueville. He was a French aristocrat who traveled to the U.S., and his purpose originally was to study the prison system of the U.S. because we were having some reform movements going on in the 1830s, and they were interested in those movements, and they wanted to take note of them, etc., make comparisons, contrast, see what could be applied back in France. But instead, right, he becomes so interested. And notice interested, I use that term deliberately. It's kind of a neutral term, because some would say that he was impressed, but reading his book, I don't think he was fully impressed. He found it interesting, for lack of a better adjective. What he saw as unique American qualities there in the States. Now, remember, he only traveled to like 3 to 5 states. So you have to keep that in mind. Historians are like, well, what did he really know, right? He was very limited in where he traveled. And so you have to keep that in mind, because he makes these broad generalizations, right? Where he says, Americans tend to this, Americans tend to that. And so, he took perhaps an abrasively broad stroke over America when he didn't have the right to do so, limited in where he traveled, etc., in the short period of time he was there and writing that book. But nevertheless, I don't think you have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? It doesn't mean that he didn't make some sound points. It doesn't mean that all his observations were null and void. What he experienced, what he observed, and he wrote it down accordingly. So, for instance, right, there's an anecdote where we don't know if it's true or not, but whereby I don't remember if he was speaking in the third person about himself or one of his compatriots, but there was a French aristocrat who tried to walk into some public building, and a very common looking American, blue collar, kind of did not show any deference to him and tried to kind of abrasively walk right in front of him inside the building. And he pretty much tells him, right, like, excuse me, don't you know who I am? How dare you? And the guy basically spits tobacco on his shoe and says, well, you might be someone special back in Europe, but back here, over here, you're nobody, right? Yeah, you're no more special than I am. And that was a telling anecdote to the sense of, and I don't mean this necessarily in a negative way, in the way that this word is used sometimes, but the sense of entitlement that the common Americans supposedly, according to de Tocqueville, felt and carried with them in their lives, that they expected the world, right? And when we talk about they as Americans, sadly, by today's standards, we're mainly talking about white men, okay? We're mainly just talking about white men. But before this, right, people like Washington, John Adams, Hamilton, even Jefferson, and claiming to be a man of the people, they lived and they portrayed themselves in a somewhat aristocratic way, right? Remember, Aristoi means the best in Greek, that they were kind of a cut above the people that they governed. And there was almost pride in that, at least from the conservative Federalist Party and later Whig Party. So for instance, right, you had Hamilton, as you may recall from a previous test, who hoped that the American electorate, at least to the positions that were elected in the federal and local state governments, that they would know a better candidate than themselves when they saw one, right? I think of, like, for instance, like, you don't have to be an athlete to vote for a sports, an athletic all-star, right? In baseball and soccer, etc. It doesn't require any athleticism on your part, but you know an athlete when you see one. And so hence you're capable of choosing the best. And hence the conservatives, they use the term stewardship. And they said that the common people who are able to vote in the states ought to elect someone who's from a higher pedigree than they are, who's better educated,
I don't know that.
who has leisure time. So hence the people in the leisure class are the wealthy, right? Who have time on their hands to read classical books, read about the Enlightenment, have time to ponder political issues, etc. And so their leaders were kind of rock stars that were kind of out of touch with the common people, and they were meant to be such, right? But at this time period, you had, for instance, in the political realm, you had log cabin campaigns. That's the term, and it was kind of meant to be derisive as a term, but that's the term that was given at this time. And candidates tried to outdo one another in claiming how common they were in their origins, in their tastes, in their outlook, in their behavior, right? They were trying to prove to the people that, hey, I'm no better than you are. I'm one of you, right? And that's supposedly a part of this paradigm shift that happened in the 1830s, is everything was becoming relative to the past, democratized. And so what a time period for someone like Andrew Jackson, right? Because this guy, first of all, his background, his ethnic and national background, he was Scots-Irish. During the War for Independence, North Carolina, for instance, at one point, said, Scots Irish, you're not welcome here. Keep on moving through. The Cumberland Gap that Daniel Boone had popularized, and go into present day Kentucky and Tennessee. They were seen as somewhat, for lack of a better way of putting it, like the scum of the earth. They were seen as libertarian and rebellious toward all authority and government, disloyal to their nation because they were only out for themselves and one another, uneducated, poor, etc., criminally prone, violent, etc. And so now, though, in this generation, that was exactly the demographic that became popular in the 1830s, right? Saying, hey, I'm no better than you. I'm Scots Irish. I come from as poor as can be. But it didn't end there, right? It's the whole rags to riches image. Is that I had no privilege status given to me. I had no special opportunities that were given to me that were not given to everybody else. And I climbed my way through grit and talent, right? To make it up to the top. And so hence, the worst thing you could do in a log cabin campaign is to appear as if you were given a position because of your dad, right? So hence, this was unfortunate for John Quincy Adams, the son of the second president, John Adams, right? He had a very fine education. He was very cosmopolitan, like a man of the world. He had been to Europe very often, was like Jefferson, he was conversant in several languages. But that actually, ironically, became a handicap for him in his public image. Like, oh, who do you think you are, right? And the negative term that they used at that time, according to de Tocqueville, was putting on airs. If you put on airs as if you were better than the common folk, that was political suicide. They didn't want that in this generation. They wanted one of their own. So the biography of Andrew Jackson, it was just perfect for him. It worked out very well for him. Historian Richard Hofstadter said that the time in which he arose, that political offices fell to him like ripe fruit from a tree. It was just perfect. It was given to him because he was perfect for the time. So not only was he Scots Irish, but he also, right, he was orphaned by the time he was like 14. His dad died in a logging accident, supposedly when his mother was pregnant with him. His mother and brother died in the War for Independence. And so he went to live with an abusive uncle, threatened to kill him for his abusive behavior, and was on his own early in life. He was in the frontier in the Tennessee, Nashville area, which was seen as, being backwoods, common folk. And he apprenticed himself to a lawyer. And that's how it went back then, because it's not going to happen, you guys, until the progressive movement of the early 1900s, when you have to actually go to law school, pass a bar exam, and all of that. It was very informal before that. You would apprentice yourself to a lawyer, work under him for a set period of time, and be eventually accepted by the bar. And so that's what he did. He also became a land surveyor. And remember, Washington did that to rise up as well, by surveying land, parceling it out, working for the land office, etc. And so, and then primary source quotes from people in Nashville area said that he had that typical frontier personality. He got in a lot of fistfights. He had a fiery temper. He was in several duels, one of which left a bullet in his chest until his dying day. He killed a person in a duel, but it was considered legal. So this dude was frontier, right? His credentials were met as far as being, from the streets, if you will, right? From a log cabin. And so it played perfectly for his image. So going back to de Tocqueville, he said, Americans, the white American poor men all expect to become rich. He said they will no sooner finish the roof of their log cabin before they greedily want a bigger and better parcel of land further west and create a bigger and better cabin and mansion eventually. He said that there was that sense of entitlement, that sense of expectation from the common white men that the American dream was theirs for the taking, just like Andrew Jackson. All right. So hence, it's going to become very profitable for politicians to promise avenues toward the American dream to their poor white male voters, right? And the two primary avenues, still at that time, were by land, offering them cheap or free land, and also offering them credit, right? Because a lot of them were wanting to become cash crop farmers instead of subsistence farmers. They weren't content with just growing their own food and subsisting. They wanted to engage in a cash crop, sell it for profit, and get rich. So, helping with debtors' laws as well. Those were easy ways for politicians to gain votes. So what were some ways in which the politicians may have not only felt tempted to do this for popularity and power, but also even perhaps felt beholden to the common poor white men to give them what they wanted? Well, for one, is virtually all the states dropped their property requirements for citizenship. So that means now non-property owning renters, poor white renters, could now vote and be citizens, right? In addition to that, the Democratic Party, they cut off the Democratic Republican part of Jefferson's time and just called themselves Democrats at this time. They did things for show as well as perhaps in substance to make the common white men feel like they were participating in government for the first time. Okay. So for instance, they started the party convention system. In that system, the Democratic Party, for instance, would have notices in the press saying when a local convention would happen and where. Any citizen could show up and nominate anybody for a public office. They would have a vote at the convention, and the winners at that local convention would go to a regional convention. The winners at the regional convention would go to a state convention. And then for some federal offices, those winners would go to a federal convention. So at least on paper, right, Joe Bob from a small town in Kentucky can run for federal office now. They democratized the nomination process. Okay. They also began lots of campaigning with parades and pyrotechnics and wild animals on leashes. Like it got bizarre, trying to enlist a sense of public enthusiasm for election days, right? So look at this. For example, the percentage of eligible citizens who voted for a presidential candidate rose from under 27% in 1824 to over 80% in 1840. That's incredible. That's an incredible jump, a relative jump compared to the past, right? So a lot of poor white dudes are going on election day and voting. And so now there's more of a sense of accountability from the politicians, right? That I better give them what they want. So you have those democratizing factors. You also have the popular election for the electoral system. At first, there were actual electors, and the number of electors were tied to the number of congressmen. 2 senators, no matter what, 1 House rep for every 30,000 civilians. And there would actually be electors that you would vote for. They would go in person to the state capitals and vote for the president. Now they started the popular election, that whoever won the popular vote got the electoral points that we do now. And so they democratized the presidential election process. And Andrew Jackson and other Democrats even tried to get rid of the electoral system itself and just go by popular vote instead of electoral points. But of course, that didn't happen because we still have the electoral system today. But they tried. Okay. So those were some ways. And then also local judge positions began, and sheriff positions, etc., began to be elected for the first time at this time. All right. And remember, is theoretically, when you think of like Montesquieu and his writings in the Enlightenment, is there supposed to be a series of checks and balances in government, whereby those in the popularly elected legislator are going to be beholden to what the majority wants, right? But the idea is who's going to look after the numerical minority, right? You have 800 out of 1,000 people say we want slavery. Well, what about the 200 people that don't want slavery? And what about the slaves, right, who have no voice? They are completely marginalized by majoritarian democracy, by just pure majority rule, right? And that's why I have at the bottom, some people would say that democracy could be like two wolves and one lamb voting on what's for dinner. Of course, the wolves are going to outvote the lamb and they're going to eat them. And so judges were put in deliberately to be handpicked and appointed for life so that they don't have to bow down to what the numerical majority wants. They could make tough decisions to theoretically defend the numerical minority, right? From, quote, the tyranny of the majority. And so now with local judge positions being elected, that's going away from that check and balance from the founding fathers, right? And leaning more toward a democratic majoritarian type of government than was perhaps wanted by the founding fathers. And that's arguable, but I think I can make that claim and defend it. So at any rate, you have that set for political. You have that set, what I mentioned, economic, as far as land and credit and help with debt relief, right? For the common white man. And then the social, we've already talked about it, how now it became in vogue or in style to be viewed as a commoner who worked his way up rather than a better sort of man, right? That's more aristocratic. So in all three realms, things were becoming supposedly democratized at this time. Well, the chief example that's used, the chief perhaps two examples actually that are used in showing problems with this majoritarian movement, right? Where the national bank issue and the issue with the, quote, 5 civilized tribes in Georgia and the Carolinas mainly. With the bank, it was true that a lot of rich people were lending money through bonds to the federal government and expecting the federal government to pay them back with interest. That a lot of wealthy big businesses were getting subsidized by the national bank. Because remember, under Hamilton, if you were engaging in a service or product that is supposed to help the whole country, then the government ought to unashamedly help you out. So to Jackson, right, he knew the common people hated banks. They hated banks because they saw them as oligarchic, as favoring the rich. So he says, I am not going to sign the renewal of the U.S. Bank, its charter, right? And instead, he encourages the allocation of those federal funds to go to local, quote, state wildcat banks. And that was not a good term. The wildcat banks were rather, kind of like the 2008 bubble with housing. They were rather irresponsible with their loans. They were giving out loans to be popular to poor, white, ambitious men. And a lot of those poor, white, ambitious men were defaulting on those loans. They were failing to pay them back. So this arguably led to the recession of 1837. It had harmful economic consequences, but it was the popular democratic thing to do. Then in addition to that, right, you have the issue with the 5 civilized tribes. Now, if you look up a term that is very interesting, is look up a term, New Eshota, New N-E-W, and then E-C-H-O-T-A. This was the very popularly covered civilized republic of the Cherokee, okay? And you look at these different mini republics, they were modeled after the US Republic with written constitutions, private property and capitalist system economically, checks and balances in government, lots of schools with the help of mutual aid societies and churches to educate the young Native American children. And they were getting press coverage that they were really living up to, quote, like white man's Anglo-American standards, right? But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. And not only did it not diminish popular prejudice against Native Americans, their success in these mini republics, but it did just the opposite. It arguably elicited envy, jealousy. Okay. And remember also, this is only a generation after the War of 1812. And then after the War of 1812, you had the Seminole Wars around 1819. And there was a lot of public anger and prejudice against the, quote, Redskins as savages, as being violent, brutal, a source of danger to frontier Americans. All right. So what does Andrew Johnson do, or Andrew Jackson? Is he capitulates. He puts gasoline on the fire to these negative popular prejudices. And I call that the populist dimension of democratization. To me, populism is when you appeal to the lowest common denominators. You appeal to people's prejudices, their greed, the ugly side to humanity, right? As long as it's popular. So it should be not hardly anyone's surprise that the states wherein these many Native American republics resided, namely North and South Carolina and Georgia, etc., Tennessee, they began issuing eminent domain laws against these Native American republics. They contended that it was not fair for the Native Americans to have some of the best, most fertile land, that they were not properly using it, which everyone knew even at that time was a lie. And that in the name of the common welfare, they needed to sell their lands back to the state governments. And you could easily guess what they were going to do with that land. They were going to offer it cheaply to their voters, to their poor, white, ambitious, racist voters. So that's what they began to do, right? And the Cherokee received the help of a guy named William Wirt, and they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. All right, let's see here. Sorry, I'm taking a while here. And it was known as the Worcester case. Worcester. And in this Worcester case, right, the Supreme Court backs up the Cherokee. And it was very wise what they did. And it's kind of telling of the type of rationale that had to be used is the first time around, supposedly, the lawyers representing the Cherokee tried to appeal to the humanitarianism and the idealism of the judges, right? That this is a land of opportunity for all, that all men are created equal, that the Native Americans are living rather impressively with their level of, quote, civilization, etc. And that didn't work. So what they did shrewdly is they made it about power, right? Most of the judges were conservative, old school Federalists. They did not want to concede power to the states. They wanted the federal government to have more power than the states did in our federal structure. And so William Wirt and the Native American lawyers shrewdly said, okay, if the states can issue eminent domain laws, that means that the federal treaties, right, from Washington, D.C., that granted those lands to the Native Americans can be made null and void by state legislation. So in the future now, you're saying states can override a federal level treaty. And that was smart because the judges are like, oh, heck no, we're not going to allow that precedent for states to have that power to nullify Washington, D.C. mandated treaty. So they said, no, a federal level treaty from D.C. trumps a mere state law. So therefore, like at New Eshota for the Cherokee, the federal treaty that gives them that land prevails. And therefore, the state eminent domain law trying to force them to sell that land is null and void, is unconstitutional. So hence they could stay where they are because the federal government said they could rather than the states. So then what happens is Andrew Jackson intervenes and says, well, Marshall made his decision. Let's see him now enforce it. He defies a Supreme Court decision. And you could easily guess his rationale is he said he has a popular mandate, like the Spanish word mandato, like a command. He has a popular mandate from the majority of male white citizens who clearly want the Native Americans to have to sell those lands back to the states. So what the majority wants, the majority gets. And then he added a second justification, which was pure paternalism, right? Paternalism, like the Native Americans are infantilized like children. And he says, Native Americans and Anglo-Americans are like oil and water. They don't and will never mix. They won't integrate. And in that they will not ever integrate, conflict is inevitable sooner or later if they reside side by side with one another. And in that conflict, just by technology and numbers alone, the Anglo-Americans clearly will win, and they will wipe out the Native Americans. So therefore, it is for the Native Americans' good that we remove them for their own protection from the Carolinas, from Georgia. And we'll give them their own place in modern-day Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, known as Indian Territory. And he sent the military in to chaperone them in their trek. And the military was rough, racist, lacking compassion. And in one famous story, a Cherokee woman said, even our male warriors are weeping. and it became known as the Trails of Tears, primarily for the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Creek. There were several of them, but one of them had about a sixth, about 1 out of 6 died on the trip. When you read about their stay in Oklahoma and Arkansas, Fort Gibson, Fort Smith, very poor conditions. A lot of them succumbed to diseases. Very kind of, what's the word I'm thinking of? Just like economically ruthless, right? Parasitical merchants came in and took advantage of their need for food, clothing, etc., and charged them exorbitant prices for such things. Such was the anger that the oh gosh, was it John Ridge? I want to say it was John Ridge. He was an assimilated Cherokee chief. He had been sent up to New England. He had become Christian. He received what was equivalent to pretty much a college education. And he grudgingly and fatalistically, along with some other leaders, signed a treaty to sell their lands and move to Indian territory. He was murdered by his own warriors as a sellout to the paleface, to the white man. And you read his biography, and it's just sad because the poor guy was just caught in the middle. It's just an overall super sad story. So hence, right, what I say at the beginning is be careful what you ask for. Andrew Jackson's time period, socially, politically, and economically experienced a democratizing trend, but that was not even remotely universally healthy and good, especially if you were amongst the marginalized, those left out, the numerical minority, those who were disenfranchised and not treated as citizens. And you have to remember also, there was a McIntosh case in the early 1820s, and it stated that Native Americans were the wards of the state, of the federal government, WARDS. And remember, a ward was no different from a prison inmate and from those who were children that were a part of government-run orphanages. Like literally, you were seen as a legally dependent person upon the federal government. Wards of the state. So what's interesting, right, is like to this day, Native Americans here in California, they can have casinos, right? Because they don't have to abide by the anti-gambling statutes of California because they're wards of Washington, D.C., not California. So they have some exemptions from state laws and state sovereignty over them, right? The reservations are federal. But I'll never forget a Native American student I had. She, almost in passing, mentioned, she said, this such and such happened before we had to move and transfer our reservation. So she finished her speech. And then I asked her afterwards, I said, I can't help, but it's just still sticking with my memory. You mentioned almost in passing that your tribe had to switch locations for its reservation. And that was here in California, in the Central Valley. And she said, oh, yeah. She said, they found oil. and the federal government made us move. So like that type of paternalistic, heavy federal hand over Native Americans, it's still alive and well. You know, the whole pipeline incident up in the north and all that. I mean, it's alive and well as an issue with Native Americans. They are not granted citizenship status until the 1920s. All right, nearly 100 years after this. So at any rate, then number two, okay, is I contend that there were three major factors that helped contribute to the beginnings. Okay, I don't pretend that this process was even remotely close to what it is today or what it ought to be perhaps in the future. But the beginnings of women's liberation from being both marginalized, like kicked in the corner and not given the same opportunities, and oppressed, right? That there were three factors in the 1800s that contributed to the improvement of their status and of their lives, okay, relative to before. One mentioned is the westward migration of Americans to the far west. All right. And sadly, it's from the narrative that I've read on this, just from one book that I've read on the subject, is good came out of abuse, basically. Is a lot of women were literally abandoned by their husbands during the gold rush and the antebellum westward migration in the 1840s across the three overland trails, right? The Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. A lot of men never came back. So in large numbers in the east of the Mississippi, a lot of women filed suits in courts claiming that their man had forfeited his rights of power over her and the children because he had left them. Because remember, we inherited English common law, and English common law, even though it was supposed to be a blend of the Germanic tribes after Rome and Rome, when it came to women, it was mainly Rome. Under Rome, right, you had the reality of the paterfamilias. The paterfamilias was the male head of the household. He had the right to physically chastise his wife as well as his children. He made all political decisions. Politically, she did not exist. He had to represent her in court. Like I said, she had no political voice whatsoever. And then economically, everything that she may have inherited from her father was immediately given to her husband once they married. Under English common law, it's called coverture, coverture. And I like literally like the word covered. Women's legal identity, their property, everything was imbibed, taken over, covered by the man once they married. So now that included also is you have under English common law, it comes from the Bible, cases in the Catholic and Anglican churches, that if there is a long history of physical abuse, if there is abandonment, and if there is adultery, that those might be small loopholes that women could use to divorce their husband. But they deliberately made it very difficult for that to happen. They wanted it so that in a very patriarchal society, that divorce ought to be the decision of the man, not the woman. So now, with women being abandoned by husbands moving westwardly, they were gaining the precedent in courts to be able to sue for a divorce and gain custody of their children. And even though they had the whole separate spheres culture, where women were seen to be more delicate and more virtuous than men, they still very hypocritically gave custody to the men. Usually the men had precedent over the women to gain custody of children. That began to change at this time, where women were gaining the right of custody of their children as well as the right to divorce their husbands. All right. And then also I have some quotes in here whereby there's a lot of primary source evidence, you guys. And I don't begin, my best conjecture is I'm sure no better than yours as to why, but there are a lot of reported cases of physical abuse in the West when the women did move with the men to the far West. And so one state after another in the West, California was right at the front of it, began protecting women and giving them certain rights and protections against such abuse. And not only that, social institutions like churches began trying to protect women, pull them out of the abuse of marriage, help economically provide for them, etc. So the westward migration in that generation, it's a sad story for women. But somewhat paradoxically, from that suffering, they were gaining political rights and opportunities that were not previously afforded them. And then not to mention, right, is a whole, we're going to get into Turner's thesis of the West pretty soon, I think next, as he contended that opportunities that were not deliberately meant for certain marginalized people, Hispanic men, for instance, women, for instance, just opened up in the West, whether people liked it or not. So women began opening inns, right? INNS, like hotels and places for people to have a bed and breakfast and so forth. They started opening up and starting their own businesses in the West and so forth. And like I said, you see, it supposedly wasn't planned, it wasn't deliberate, but it organically happened nevertheless. So women started getting job opportunities, taking advantage of job opportunities in the West. Then, in addition to westward migration, what also helped women was the beginnings of the first industrial revolution. All right. For the first time in the antebellum period of the 1830s through 50s, is work began to move from the family household to a mill. And the mills were the first factories. All right. You had the introduction of interchangeable parts, which will be the beginning of assembly line production, machine tools, the steam engine and use of steam power. All of that comes into fruition, at least its early beginnings, as early as the 1830s. All right. Well, some, once again, kind of, unintended consequences is in Lowell, Massachusetts. It got a lot of national attention where they began these textile mills of using these spinning steam powered power looms to make clothing out of cloth. And a lot of people contend that it was not any kind of sociological experiment by any means, but it was pure greed. Is the mill owners wanted to cut their overhead. They didn't want to have to pay out stingily too much money and maximize their profits. And it was societally accepted to pay young unmarried women a lot less than they would have to pay in wages to a male. So a lot of them began doing just that, hiring young unmarried girls to work in the mills. They tried, and at this time, right away, it scared patriarchal America. People are like, oh, good God, you're taking the daughters away from their fathers and they're going to become promiscuous. They're going to start getting all these ideas about their own empowerment, etc. But economic greed prevailed, and they still, in large numbers, were beginning to be hired out and work outside their homes with other young ladies. And so, for one, right, that broadened their horizons of being able to interact with other girls. They tried to control them, right? They put them in basically dormitories, and they had to stay there throughout the year, throughout the week. And they had cots, they had their meals, everything was given and allotted there at the mill site, at least in Lowell and these other areas. Because they were trying to, right, keep them from getting any wild ideas or behavior, right, in their head, or behavior that they would carry out. But nevertheless, it still was empowering for the girls. It gave them an independent wage. It's going to take some time, though, for the courts to acknowledge their rights to independent wages. So the dads oftentimes could still demand their money. But in some cases, it didn't happen. All right. So we're still very far from women becoming economically self-sufficient. We can't exaggerate this. But again, relative to the generations before, this was an improvement. This was helping young ladies. Okay. So at any rate, a third one factor that's mentioned are the antebellum reform movements. I want to keep this basic because we're going to cover this in the future in 2 weeks. But there arose in the antebellum period several, and I mean several, quite a few, reform movements all across the country. There was reform against physical abuse and child abuse, against child labor, against alcoholism, against prison conditions for the psychologically ill, against slavery, against these are a couple fancy words, but against the bourgeois homogenization of society. Bourgeois just means people of the city. Homogenization, everyone culturally becoming the same. The main movement against that comes to mind are the transcendentalists. And I want to get more into them in the future. But suffice it to say now that the transcendentalists were trying to tell people, hey, don't conform to convention and tradition and what society tells you how to act and how to think and so forth. Think and behave outside the box. And we'll get back to them later. But at any rate, because a lot of these reform movements, right, entailed a sense of victimization by one demographic or another. Victimization of slaves, victimization of children, victimization of prison inmates, whatever it might be, right? It was largely culturally considered a compassionate or benevolent movement, right? And remember the whole separate spheres paradigm, that women are innately much different from men. They're more delicate. They're more morally upright and virtuous. They're more kind and compassionate and sentimental. It was seen as culturally acceptable for women to not only participate in these reform movements, but to even lead some of them. Because after all, right, who better to look after the victims of society than the women? So to me, right, a couple terms that I've read that I thought they made sense to me is one was like women were now politically being able to enter the political realm through the back door, almost kind of sneakily, right? Because they could just say, hey, we're just being women. We're just looking after victims, right? And also another term that's used is that these benevolent movements became known as kind of a dress rehearsal for their future feminist activities. Because what did they do? They began learning the tools, the methods to be able to make change in society. They engaged in protest parades. They collected signatures. Some even had the audacity to publicly speak to crowds. That was considered scandalous, believe it or not, for women to speak in public, especially to men and not just to other women. But they began doing it. And of course, there was backlash, as you would expect, but it happened nevertheless, right? So to me, and to the books I've read, the antebellum reform movements really helped women in the long run. It gave them political practice. It gave them, like I said, almost a route through the back door to be able to enter politics. So those three, the Industrial Revolution, westward migration, and the antebellum reform movements and the women's participation and even leadership thereof, helped women relative to previous generations begin to liberate themselves as a demographic. Does that make sense? Right. So the three of you that are still here with me, I'm going to give you a few extra points beyond the others. I appreciate you sticking with me. All right. Does anybody have any questions? You guys feel pretty good about this assignment? I know I'm a history nerd, but I think this stuff is fascinating. The 19th century in America was fascinating. Really was. All right. So you can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel okay on this? Feel pretty good? Thank you, Clara. Okay, you guys feel okay? Kevin, Rahaf?
Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
I just want to ask, will the Zoom meeting be on Canvas?
I'm sorry?
Will this Zoom meeting be on Canvas?
It will.
Okay.
Yes, I'll post this. I'll post this Zoom on Canvas underneath
Okay.
the assignment.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah,
All right, you
thank you.
guys. Thank you, Clara. It's always a pleasure having you guys. I hope that you're I hope that it's not painful doing this stuff. I hope it's not painfully boring. I understand history is not for everybody, but I think there's some pretty cool stuff in here. All right, well, you guys have a good week, okay? You guys take care. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.